The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 12 degrees below zero when Frank Miller made the mistake that would change how he understood winter farming forever. It was January 1938, and the Depression had already taught him hard lessons about making do with less, but this morning would teach him something his father should have told him before he died the previous spring. This morning would teach him why every old-timer in Webster County filled their water buckets only 3/4 full, and why ignoring that simple rule could mean the difference between survival and disaster when you had 30 head of cattle depending on you, and the nearest hardware store was 20 miles away on roads buried under 3 feet of snow. Frank had been farming his own place for just 8 months. The 160 acres spread in south-central Nebraska had been in his family since 1889, passed down from his grandfather, who homesteaded it after coming west from Pennsylvania. Frank grew up on this land, worked these fields since he was old enough to walk behind a plow, but working alongside his father and running the operation himself turned out to be two very different things. His father had died in April, sudden heart attack, while checking fence line, and Frank inherited not just the land, but all the responsibilities that came with it. At 24 years old, he became the sole provider for his mother, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Emma. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders every single day, but never heavier than on cold January mornings when everything that could go wrong seemed determined to do exactly that. The trouble started the night before. Frank had been hauling water from the well to the barn, filling buckets for the morning feeding. The cattle needed water twice daily in winter, and with the pond frozen solid since early December, every drop had to be pumped by hand and carried in galvanized steel buckets across 100 yards of frozen ground. It was back-breaking work, and after the 14th trip that evening, Frank was exhausted. His hands were numb inside worn leather gloves, his back ached, and he still had evening milking to finish. Before he could eat the supper Sarah had been keeping warm on the stove for 2 hours. So when he filled those last 6 buckets, he filled them to the brim. Why make an extra trip tomorrow if he could fit more water in each bucket tonight? It seemed like simple efficiency, the kind of practical thinking that helped a man get through endless winter chores before dark. He left those 6 full buckets sitting in the barn, lined up along the north wall, where he always kept the water supply. The barn was warmer than outside, but not by much. Even with 30 cattle breathing and generating body heat, the temperature inside the barn that night probably never got above 15 degrees. Frank went back to the house, ate his cold supper, played with Emma until her bedtime, and fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. He had no idea what was happening out in that barn while he slept. Water is a strange substance. Most materials contract when they get colder, shrinking as their molecules slow down and pack closer together. Water does that too, but only down to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that temperature, something remarkable happens. The molecules start arranging themselves into crystalline structures, forming the 6-sided lattices we recognize as ice. These crystal structures take up more space than liquid water molecules, about 9% more space to be exact. That expansion creates tremendous force, enough force to crack engine blocks, burst pipes, and split boulders, and more than enough force to destroy a galvanized steel bucket filled to the brim with no room for that expansion to go anywhere except outward against the metal walls. Frank found the first destroyed bucket at 5:30 the next morning. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when he pulled on his boots and coat and headed out to start morning chores. The snow crunched under his feet, so cold it sounded like breaking glass. His breath came out in thick white clouds that froze into tiny ice crystals before they could dissipate. Inside the barn, the cattle were restless, moving in their stanchions, their own breath creating a fog that hung in the cold air. Frank lit the kerosene lantern and carried it toward the water buckets, and that is when he saw the damage. The first bucket had split straight up one side, a clean vertical tear in the galvanized steel about 8 inches long. Ice had expanded through that split like a frozen waterfall, pushing out and up as the water froze solid overnight. The second bucket had cracked around the bottom rim, the entire base separating from the walls. The third had burst at the handle mounts, the metal rivets driven out by the force of expanding ice. The fourth and fifth showed similar damage. 6 buckets, all destroyed in a single night. 6 buckets that represented a significant investment for a family barely scraping by in the 8th year of the worst economic depression the country had ever seen. Frank just stood there for a long moment, holding the lantern, looking at the wreckage. Each of those buckets had cost 65 cents new, which might not sound like much, but in 1938, 65 cents was what a farm laborer earned for a full day's work. 6 buckets meant nearly $4, and $4 was what his family spent on groceries for an entire week. More than that, buckets were not something you could just replace in January in rural Nebraska. The hardware store in town might have a few in stock, but getting to town meant hitching up the wagon or cranking up the old Model T, neither of which was reliable in this weather. And even if he could get to town, spending $4 on buckets meant taking that money from somewhere else, from some other essential expense that a farm family in winter could not afford to sacrifice. But the money was not even the worst part. The worst part was that he now had to water 30 head of cattle with whatever buckets he could salvage, and morning chores were already running late. The worst part was knowing this was completely preventable, completely his own fault. The worst part was realizing that his father had probably known this, that every experienced farmer in the county knew this, that this was exactly the kind of practical wisdom that got passed down from generation to generation. Except Frank never asked, and his father never had the chance to tell him. He salvaged what he could. 2 buckets were undamaged because they had been filled only halfway the previous evening. He could use those. 2 more had cracks but could still hold water if he did not move them too roughly. That gave him 4 functioning buckets for 30 cattle. He would have to make more trips, many more trips, and every trip meant pumping more water and carrying it across that frozen distance between well and barn. What should have been a 1-hour morning chore was going to take 3 hours, maybe longer. And he still had to feed, still had to milk, still had to do every other task that could not be postponed just because he had created extra work for himself through ignorance. Frank started pumping water. The well was 140 feet deep, sunk back in 1892 when his grandfather first developed the property. The pump was mounted on a wooden platform, and working the long iron handle in winter was an exercise in endurance. The metal was so cold it burned through his gloves. Ice built up around the spout where water dripped and froze. Each stroke of the pump brought up water from deep underground, still liquid despite the surface cold, and that water had to be caught in buckets and carried immediately before it could freeze. 4 buckets meant 4 trips to fill them, 4 trips across the yard, 4 trips that turned his hands numb and made his shoulders scream, then back to do it all again, and again, and again, until every animal had drunk its fill. Sarah came out to the barn around 7, worried because Frank had not come in for breakfast. She found him on his 12th trip from the well, ice crusted in his eyebrows and mustache, his coat wet where water had slopped over the bucket rims. She saw the destroyed buckets lined up against the barn wall like evidence of failure, and she understood immediately what had happened, even though Frank had not said a word. She took one of the salvaged buckets without speaking and started making trips herself, mother and daughter waiting back in the house while both parents worked to undo the consequences of one night's mistake. They finished morning chores at 9:30, 4 hours after Frank first stepped into the barn. Emma had already eaten the oatmeal Sarah left warming on the stove and was playing on the kitchen floor when they finally came inside. Frank sat down at the table and put his face in his hands, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually cry, though he did not. He just sat there, exhausted and frustrated and angry at himself, while she poured hot coffee and scrambled fresh eggs, and did not say any of the things she was thinking about, being more careful or asking advice or remembering that they could not afford mistakes right now. Later that morning, after he had eaten and warmed up and checked on the livestock one more time, Frank walked across the section to his neighbor's place. Jim Patterson was 62 years old and had been farming in Webster County since before Frank was born. His place bordered the Miller property on the west side, and over the years, Frank had learned that Jim knew just about everything worth knowing about making a living from this land. Jim was in his workshop when Frank arrived, repairing harness leather by the light of a pot-belly stove. He looked up when Frank knocked, took one look at the younger man's face and said to come in and warm up. Frank told him about the buckets. He expected Jim to laugh, or at least crack a smile at the city-bred stupidity of it, but the old farmer just nodded and kept working his needle through the heavy leather. When Frank finished talking, Jim set down his work and poured coffee from a battered pot sitting on the stove. He handed Frank a cup and then started talking, and what he said in the next 20 minutes was worth more than 6 destroyed buckets could ever cost. Jim explained that every material has what you might call personality. Wood swells when it gets wet and shrinks when it dries. Metal expands in heat and contracts in cold. Leather stretches when you work it and stiffens when you neglect it. Understanding those personalities is what separates a farmer who survives from one who fails, especially in winter when every mistake gets magnified by cold and distance and limited resources. Water freezing in a bucket is not just water freezing in a bucket. It is a test of whether you understand the fundamental nature of the world you are working with. Old-timers never filled buckets more than 3/4 full in winter because they knew ice expands. They learned it from their fathers, who learned it from their fathers, going back generations to when people first started keeping livestock in climates where water froze solid for months at a time. Leave a quarter of the bucket empty, and that empty space gives the ice somewhere to expand upward instead of outward. The ice still freezes, still takes up more room than the liquid water did, but instead of bursting the bucket walls, it just rises higher above the rim, forming a dome of solid ice that you can break up and remove in the morning before adding fresh water. The bucket survives. You don't have to make extra trips. You don't have to spend money you cannot afford on replacements. You just have to know this one simple thing and remember to do it every single time you fill a bucket in cold weather. But Jim did not stop there. He went on to explain all the other ways water and ice would try to destroy your equipment if you did not respect their nature. Never leave water standing in pump mechanisms overnight because the ice could crack the casting. Never fill a canning jar completely before freezing because the expansion would shatter the glass. Never let your water troughs fill so high that freezing water could not expand upward without cracking the wood or concrete. He talked about a farmer up in Cherry County who lost an entire irrigation system in 1926 because he did not drain the pipes before winter, and the expanding ice destroyed every joint and connection across 40 acres of fields. He talked about the winter of 1912, when temperatures stayed below zero for 3 straight weeks, and half the farmers in the county lost equipment because they were too inexperienced or too careless to understand what cold could do to carelessness. Jim was not being mean about it. He was just stating facts, passing down knowledge the way it had always been passed down, through stories of what worked and what failed and why. He told Frank that every farmer learns some lessons the hard way, and 6 destroyed buckets was a cheap tuition compared to what some people paid for their education. The important thing was learning the lesson, so you did not pay for it twice. The important thing was understanding that farming was not just about working hard, but about working smart, about knowing your materials and your weather and your limitations. Pride got people killed in winter. Ignorance got people killed in winter. Being willing to ask questions and listen to answers kept people alive. Frank walked back home with his head full of new knowledge and a strong desire to never feel that stupid again. He spent that afternoon going through every system on the property, looking for other places where freezing water could cause damage he had not anticipated. He checked the pump mechanism and found ice building up in places he needed to clean. He checked the water lines to the house and made sure they were properly insulated in the crawl space. He went through every bucket, every container, every vessel that might hold water, and he made a mental note about how full to fill each one in winter. And that evening, when he hauled water to the barn for the night feeding, he filled each remaining bucket exactly 3/4 full, leaving that critical empty space at the top for expansion. The winter of 1938 was brutal across the Great Plains. Temperatures dropped below zero repeatedly between January and March. Snow fell in heavy blankets that took weeks to melt. The roads stayed impassable for days at a time, isolating farm families in white silence, broken only by wind and the sounds of livestock needing care. It was the kind of winter that tested everyone, that sorted the prepared from the unprepared, that made the difference between knowledge and ignorance a matter of survival rather than convenience. Frank never lost another bucket to ice that winter. He never lost one the winter after that, or any winter for the next 40 years he farmed that land. The lesson of those 6 destroyed buckets stayed with him, became part of the knowledge he carried, part of the accumulated wisdom of practical experience. When his own son was old enough to handle morning chores, Frank showed him how to fill water buckets in winter, and he explained why. And he told the story of that January morning in 1938 when he learned the hard way. The knowledge passed down the way it always had, from one generation to the next, carried forward in stories and demonstrations, and the simple act of doing things right, because doing them wrong had consequences you did not want to repeat. But the lesson went deeper than just water buckets. What Frank really learned that winter was about humility and asking questions and understanding that traditional practices existed for solid reasons. All across rural America, in thousands of farming communities, people had spent generations figuring out how to work with nature instead of against it. They learned which materials held up in which conditions. They learned how to read weather, how to preserve food, how to maintain equipment with minimal resources. They learned that you could not just muscle your way through challenges with hard work alone. You had to think, had to observe, had to respect the fundamental properties of the physical world you were manipulating every day. The Great Depression taught everyone to be careful with resources, to maintain what they had because replacements were expensive or impossible to obtain. But the deeper lesson was about stewardship, about understanding that farming was a partnership with land and weather and natural law. You could not change the fact that water expanded when it froze. You could not prevent temperatures from dropping below zero. What you could do was work within those constraints intelligently, applying knowledge and foresight to avoid problems before they occurred. Fill the bucket 3/4 full. Leave space for expansion. It was such a simple thing, but it represented a whole way of thinking about the world and your place in it. Winter watering remained one of the most demanding tasks on any livestock farm in cold climates. Even after Frank learned the bucket lesson, the work was still exhausting. Every morning and evening, someone had to pump water and carry it across frozen ground to thirsty cattle. The water had to be fresh, because livestock would not drink water with a skim of ice on top. The buckets had to be cleaned regularly, because mineral deposits built up faster in winter. The pump had to be maintained, because a broken pump in January meant hauling water from the creek or melting snow on the stove, either option adding hours to daily chores. There was no easy way to do it, no shortcut that eliminated the physical labor of keeping animals hydrated when every natural water source was frozen solid. Some farms eventually invested in heated water tanks, electric systems that kept stock tanks from freezing even in the coldest weather. But those systems were expensive and required electricity, which many rural farms did not have until the Rural Electrification Administration brought power lines to remote areas in the late 1930s and through the 1940s. For farms without electricity, or for farmers who could not afford heated tanks, winter watering meant manual labor and galvanized buckets and the knowledge to use them correctly. It meant understanding ice expansion and material properties and all the small details that separated successful farming from costly failure. The practice of filling buckets 3/4 full in winter was not written down in any manual or textbook. It was not taught in agricultural colleges or printed in farming magazines. It was vernacular knowledge, the kind of practical wisdom that existed in communities rather than institutions, passed along through demonstration and story rather than formal instruction. When Jim Patterson showed Frank how to do it right, he was participating in an educational system that predated schools and books, a system where knowledge flowed from experience to observation to practice. It was the same way people learned to shoe horses, to preserve vegetables, to predict weather, to fix machinery with limited tools and improvised parts. The knowledge existed because it was useful, and it survived because people taught it to each other and to their children. This kind of traditional knowledge covered every aspect of farm life. Farmers knew that you planted potatoes during the dark of the moon and harvested them during the light. They knew that the first frost could be predicted by watching how high hornets built their nests. They knew that leather harnesses lasted longer if you treated them with neat's foot oil before storing them for winter. They knew that you never let pigs get fat too fast because the meat would not cure properly. They knew that butter churned easier at 60 degrees than at 70. They knew 1,000 small things that made the difference between prosperity and poverty. between success and failure, between life and death when margins were thin and mistakes were expensive. Some of this knowledge was based on careful observation and solid reasoning. Ice expands, so leave room in containers. That is physics, proven and reliable. Some of it was based on pattern recognition that worked even if the underlying causes were not understood. Plant by the moon phases and generations of farmers would swear their crops did better, even if modern science might question the mechanism. Some of it was probably superstition, patterns people saw that were not really there, but even superstitions can contain kernels of useful practice wrapped in questionable explanation. The important thing was that the knowledge worked often enough to be valuable, and it was free, requiring no investment beyond attention and memory, and the willingness to learn from those who came before. Frank Miller kept farming that Webster County place until 1978, when arthritis and age finally convinced him to sell the operation and move to town. His son took over a different farm in the county, running his own cattle and growing his own crops on land that had supported his family for 4 generations. The buckets Frank used in his later years were still galvanized steel, still carried by hand from well to barn on winter mornings, still filled 3/4 full because that was how you filled water buckets in cold weather, if you had any sense. The fundamental realities of winter farming had not changed much despite 40 years of progress. Water still froze, ice still expanded, cattle still needed water twice a day. The knowledge that protected equipment and prevented waste remained as relevant in 1978 as it had been in 1938. But the world around that unchanging reality was transforming rapidly. By the 1970s, many farms had switched to automatic waterers, heated systems that let cattle drink directly from insulated tanks without anyone hauling buckets. Tractors had replaced horses, electricity had replaced kerosene lamps, and the kind of isolation Frank knew in 1938 was disappearing as better roads and more vehicles made towns accessible even in winter storms. The traditional knowledge that kept farms running for generations was being replaced by technology and systems that made much of that knowledge obsolete. Young farmers did not need to know about filling buckets 3/4 full if their cattle drank from heated waterers. They did not need to know about reading weather signs if they had radio forecasts. They did not need to know 100 old skills if modern equipment and products could accomplish the same tasks more efficiently. Something was gained in that exchange, but something was also lost. The efficiency and comfort of modern farming methods freed people from brutal physical labor and reduced the constant grinding stress of making do with limited resources. That was progress, and it was real, and it made farm life more sustainable and less punishing. But the loss of traditional knowledge meant the loss of resilience, the loss of the ability to improvise and adapt when systems failed or resources disappeared. It meant dependence on supply chains and electrical grids and financial systems that were beyond individual control. The farmer who knew how to water cattle with buckets could still farm if the power went out or the heated waterer broke. The farmer who only knew how to use automatic systems was helpless without them. Frank understood this even as he bought his first electric waterers in the 1960s. He understood that convenience had costs, that every system you came to depend on was a potential point of failure, that the old hard ways were valuable precisely because they worked under almost any circumstance. He still kept buckets in his barn, still made sure they were in good repair, still remembered that January morning when 6 destroyed buckets taught him to respect water and ice and the fundamental properties of physical reality. He kept that knowledge alive not because he needed it every day, but because he might need it someday. And when you needed it desperately and immediately, with no time to learn from mistakes. The story of those winter water buckets is a small story, insignificant in the grand sweep of American history. No wars were fought over bucket-filling techniques. No fortunes were made or lost based on understanding ice expansion. It was just one young farmer learning one small lesson on one cold morning in rural Nebraska during the Depression. But multiply that small story by thousands of farmers, learning thousands of small lessons, and you begin to understand how agricultural communities actually functioned, how knowledge moved through them, how practices developed and persisted and eventually disappeared. You begin to understand that farming was not just about courage and hard work, though it required both. It was also about observation and memory, and the humility to learn from those who had already paid the tuition of experience. In the end, the reason old farms never filled water buckets to the top in winter was simple physics applied through practical experience. Ice expands. Metal can only take so much pressure before it fails. Empty space at the top of a bucket gives expansion somewhere to go. 3 generations of farmers learned this lesson and taught it to their children because 6 buckets destroyed in one night was a hard way to learn something that could be taught in 30 seconds. The knowledge was not complicated or mysterious. It was just one small piece of the vast accumulated wisdom that made it possible to keep livestock alive through brutal winters on the Great Plains of America, when survival often depended on knowing exactly how full to fill a water bucket on a January night, when the temperature was dropping towards 0 and morning seemed like it would never come. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of forgotten farm wisdom, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who appreciates American agricultural history. Your support helps us preserve these stories and the traditional knowledge of rural communities who built this country through hard work and practical wisdom. This video is inspired by real historical facts and the genuine experiences of American farm families during the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group. Frank Miller is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations and learned these same lessons during this era. The practices and knowledge described here are based on authentic historical farming methods from this period in American agricultural history.